So what is the first thing that comes to mind when you hear the word peace? When you think of the word peace, how would you maybe define it? As I was thinking about this, the first thing that popped into my mind was just simply no war, right? Maybe something like nations signing a peace treaty, or two enemies coming together to shake hands to say, all right, no more fighting, we're putting an end to this. And I even looked up the word peace in the dictionary, and I found something very interesting. I noticed that all of the definitions for the word peace were all in the negative form. They were all saying what it wasn't, essentially. So all of the definitions were worded something like, peace is a lack of disturbance, or a time in which there is no war, or peace is the absence of disorder, or dissension, or hostility, or violence, that kind of thing. And do you find this strange at all? I mean, I would love there to be an end to all world wars, don't get me wrong, but isn't there more that we can say about peace in the positive sense, right? Instead of just saying what it's not war, what is it in the positive sense? How can we better understand peace? We hear Jesus talking about peace in our gospel today, and it definitely sounds like he is talking about something very real and something very concrete, not just an absence of war or an absence of fighting. He says to his disciples, "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. Not as the world gives, do I give it to you." So what is this peace that Jesus wants to give us? And how is it different from what we've been talking about up to this point? Well, it's important to remember that Jesus is saying this to his apostles during the Last Supper, right? And the fact that he's saying this during the Last Supper, that makes all the difference. And that's the key to understanding what this peace is that Jesus wants to give us. And at every Mass, just before we receive communion, the priest repeats those same words that we hear in our gospel today. The priest says, "Peace I leave you, my peace I give you." He's repeating those words from Jesus. So I think another way that we could hear Jesus' words in our gospel today is this: communion I leave with you. My communion I give to you. Brothers and sisters, the peace that Jesus gives us is communion. It's the Eucharist. It's here that we discover that real positive definition of peace, which is a soul communing with God and with one another, a soul united with God and with one another. And Jesus gives us this peace by giving us himself, his very body, blood, soul, and divinity in the Eucharist. Because Jesus is peace. Jesus is peace. Jesus is the perfect union of God and man, right? That's what peace is, the union of God and man. And the only way that we can receive that peace is through Jesus, that peace that we so desperately need and long for. This peace that comes from the Eucharist, that comes from communion, the world cannot give. And it's the peace that the world does not even know, because it's so much more than just the absence or the lack of war or the lack of conflict. In fact, it's a peace that transcends, that goes beyond these realities. Where the world says peace is not possible in the presence of war, Jesus enters into these brutal realities of our life, and he tells a different story. He steps into our hearts to show us that he is our true peace. He is what we are really seeking, the source of our joy and rest. Because Jesus knows that here on earth, even if we were to get rid of all the wars, all the fighting, all the tension in our country, our hearts would still be seeking something else. Something else. We won't truly be at peace in our hearts and at peace with one another until we know Jesus and give ourselves away in love like he did. So what does this peace look like? The peace that comes from communion is the peace of martyrs who go to their deaths singing and praising God, at the same time forgiving their enemies, forgiving the very people who are murdering them. It's the peace we saw in Mother Teresa, who transformed the world by her devoted life to the poor and the sick and the dying in Calcutta, India. It's the peace of a man who lost his wife at way too young of an age, but he continues to pray and hope in the resurrection. It's the peace of forgiving someone who has hurt you, even though they may not deserve it, you may not feel like forgiving them. It's asking God to pray through you, asking Jesus to offer that forgiveness through you if you can't do it. It's the peace of fellow Catholics gathering around this altar with all of our different personalities, our brokenness, our baggage, our struggles, whatever we bring with us here, gathering around this altar so that God can do something in us and through us that we cannot do on our own. It's through the Eucharist, through communion, that Jesus gives us his peace that says, in the midst of whatever you're going through, he says, I know you. I know what you're going through. I'm with you in this. I love you and I care for you, and you are part of something so much bigger than you even realize. Do not let your heart be troubled. Do not let your heart be afraid. Let me live my life in you. And when we do that, when we let Christ live his life in us and through us, then we will know that peace. Like Jesus talks about, following the commandments, following the teachings of the church. And other people will see it in us, right? And they'll want it too. This peace is attractive. The world is dying for this peace, the peace that only Jesus can give. They'll see that we aren't carried away by the winds of change, and that despite whatever situation we're in, we seem to have a deep joy about us, something that cannot be shaken by our earthly situations. And maybe they'll even ask you, how do you do it? What's your secret? I've noticed something different in you. What's going on? And you can tell them, it's the peace that only Jesus can give. It's the peace of communion. It's the peace of the Eucharist. And then they will probably look at you weird and say, okay, and probably walk away a little bit confused. But it's the reality. The world does not understand this peace right off the bat. But we need to show them what it is. Brothers and sisters, the peace that we long for, the peace that we were made for, is not just the absence of war, the absence of conflict, as good as that is. We were made for union with God and with one another. And that peace comes from Christ alone, who is the union of God and man. He gives himself to us in the Eucharist. When we come to communion, our hearts are offered a gift that only he can give. And so let us ready our hearts to receive that gift today, asking God to increase our desire for that peace, so that in a troubled and fearful world, our lives may become a living sign of God's peace to all that we encounter.